Alright, let's get started, shall we? So, Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are games that exist, and that's probably the most accurate assessment I can give of them, honestly. So, they're not bad. They are eminently playable, and I had a really good time playing them. However, I just sort of came away feeling a little bit like I wanted more. Like, there was something about these games that didn't satisfy me. And so I sort of want to dig into that a little bit and then sort of from there proceed into talking about the general direction of the franchise and kind of why I hope Legends Arceus sort of gives us a change finally. And by the looks of it, that's going to be the case. It seems like these games are going to be a fairly positive shift for the franchise in a new direction that has never been tried before. So, the biggest problem that I have with the games, and I think everyone shares this complaint, is that they're faithful, but to the wrong game. So, the biggest problem with Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl is that they're remakes of Diamond and Pearl, some of the weaker mainline games in the franchise. And what I mean by this isn't so much that like, oh, Gen 4 is bad, so much as the first iteration of Gen 4 had a ton of problems that Platinum fixed. And this game decides to revert pretty much all of them for no apparent reason. And as a result, we have the one pair of remakes with the least number of changes to their original iteration. Like, there are less changes to these games than there were to Fire Red and Leaf Green. And obviously there are some changes here, so don't take this as me saying that the games haven't changed at all. They have, just not nearly enough to overcome a lot of these problems. The biggest problem is, as we sort of all predicted, the Sinnoh Dex. This game reverts to the 151 Pokemon Sinnoh Dex found in Diamond and Pearl. Now there is some ability to access other Pokemon through the underground, but it's a bit limited, and in some cases the evolution items necessary to make those Pokemon viable are not able to be found until their normal locations in the post-game, essentially locking you out of some pretty damn good Pokemon. Moreover, though, you see this shine through with the trainers as well, because we have a lot of trainers, especially in the gyms, not using Pokemon of that gym's type. We see that mostly starting in the 6th gym, where like half the trainers' Pokemon aren't Steel type, but just know a Steel move. On top of the faithfulness issue, there's also the fact that the games have a fair number of broken mechanics. Because the games use Diamond and Pearl's trainer tables, we now have a case of where the experience curve is way off because it uses the modern experience curve and did not balance the trainers to the fact that you do not gain the same amount of experience as you did in the old games. You gain a lot more. And now, that could be fixed by making it toggleable, but that notwithstanding, because I really don't want to get into that discourse right now, the broader problem with these games is the fact that they just weren't balanced. If you're going to have an experience system where everyone gains experience, the game needs to be balanced to that. Not me having like all my Pokemon be 10 to 15 levels over the gym leaders up until I hit the Elite Four. Because a good difficulty curve does not consist of easy 90% of the game and then just jumping right at the champion. That's a problem. And it was very apparent in these games. Now granted, a lot of other Pokemon games are like this, including the original Gen 4 games, but it's a lot more apparent here. Now that's not to say that there's nothing good about these games at all. There are a lot of things to actually like about them. For starters, the new Underground gives you a lot more options to play with and access to some Pokemon that you couldn't get at those points in Platinum. On top of that, we see some of the most difficult Gym Leader and Elite Four rematches in any game in the franchise. These fights are actually hard. Like, I was pretty much on level with Cynthia all 3 times, and I continued to struggle against her Garchomp. These games do not joke around once you get to that point. The problem is getting to that point. Overall, I think the broader problem with these games is the fact that Pokemon's design philosophy has gotten really muddled over the years. So, obviously, a lot of the modern issues started during X and Y, and I don't think anyone is going to contest that. The broken experience share was introduced in those games, as well as the fact that that was the point when the games went 3D, and we started to see a lot less content, at least from a surface glance. And part of that, at least in the case of X and Y, was the amount of resources that had to be dedicated to modeling all 700 some odd Pokemon at the time. An issue that continued to seem to plague the franchise up until Sword and Shield, when they had to cut Pokemon, supposedly citing both animations and balance. Now, we can talk about whether or not those animations were any good, but the balance thing is an actual issue. And a lot of the other stuff with the animations that people complained about were the result of Pokemon sort of designing themselves into a corner with this franchise. And frankly, X and Y is where that really started to show. Because when you build a franchise like this with this conceit of gotta catch 'em all, then you have to continue supporting all of the previous monsters even as you add new ones as the games go on. And you can see having several hundred Pokemon and several hundred moves to animate every generation and have it look good, you'll start to have a lot of strain on that process, and it cuts into other parts of the game. So, broadly speaking, having more and more Pokemon creates more and more problems. And so the solution is to cut them. But they didn't, until they had gone on for way too long and normalized the idea way too much. But, I'm not the first person to say that and to sort of explain that this was a problem of scale that Game Freak themselves created and could have been solved by cutting Pokemon as early as Ruby and Sapphire. But that still doesn't quite answer how we got to Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. Because before that, we had Oras, which were remakes that included all of the Pokemon at the time, and made a lot of changes that really improved the original Ruby and Sapphire. And while it doesn't quite copy Emerald and exceed it in every way, you still have this experience that's better than its base version. So what happened between those games and BDSP that saw the games decide to cut out a lot of the improvements that previous remakes had? And to that, I really don't have an answer. I mean, in a sense, Dexit was part of it. Cutting Pokemon meant that Game Freak didn't really have the incentive to add all of the old Pokemon back in. And we saw that in other remakes as well. The Mystery Dungeon remake, for instance, doesn't include any Pokemon really from Generation 4 onward, except ones that are evolutions of Pokemon that were already in the original Red and Blue Rescue Team. And on the same token, we saw that happen as well in Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, which has sort of set the template for the modern remake in a sense. Not exactly, but this idea of only using the Pokemon that were available at the time and not bringing in newer Pokemon really started there, if you think about it. That was the first game in the franchise to cut Pokemon. And it honestly was something that we thought was going to be a one-off because Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee were designed around sort of this nostalgia factor, but clearly it's a signal that they were going to continue doing that going forward. But we kind of all missed the signs because we sort of all wrote those games off as a spin-off, despite the fact that they technically weren't. And so now, we're at a crossroads. We have a game coming out that poses to change virtually everything we know about how you play Pokemon. The first time ever. And we are at this point now where the possibilities are endless. I mean, I know the whole game has been leaked onto the internet at this point, but I haven't been looking at them and have been aggressively blocking anyone on Twitter who posts anything remotely resembling a leak. Just to let you know that if I see anything, I will not hesitate to do it. So the question remains is, are we going to see this style continue on going forward at the expense of what came before? Sort of like what we're sort of seeing with Zelda right now. In my opinion, we're probably not going to see the old style go away. Because it already seems apparent that VGC for now is going to stay in Sword and Shield, and due to the fact that VGC and sort of just the competitive scene in general for the franchise is so lucrative, I don't see Game Freak and the Pokemon Company completely axing the old style when that's where that scene thrives in and continues to operate. So I think this is going to be a case of where we're going to see basically two games in the franchise, sort of this newer direction with Legends Arceus and whatever comes after it, and games like Sword and Shield, like BDSP, that keep that old direction. But I guess for now, only time will tell. The other thing that I found a bit interesting about this whole BDSP Legends Arceus situation is the way in which we started to talk about older games. So it's no surprise that whatever game came out like 5 to 7 years ago is now considered the underrated gem or the best game in the franchise. We saw it a lot with Black and White. Black and White got hated on a lot when they came out, but it seems now that the community absolutely loves Black and White, especially Black and White 2. Black and White 2 gets upheld as like the pinnacle of the franchise in a lot of ways. And also, we see the same thing with Generation 4, namely Platinum and Heart Gold and Soul Silver. And we'll talk about that latter game in a second, because that is a huge part of the discourse right now. But what's more interesting is that it seems more recently that that attitude is happening towards X and Y, as well as some small inklings in the direction of Sun and Moon. But we'll see in due time whether or not they get treated the same way. But the thing that makes me wonder is, are these the same people, or is the shape of the community itself changing in a way that the people who like those games the most are now the dominant voices online? And that very well could be a possibility. A lot of people, as they get older and, start to have families, have less time to be super active on sites like Reddit and Twitter, and so it would make sense that they recede from these message boards and get replaced by people who uphold different games, i.e. the ones they played when they were younger. Because we seem to talk about the fandom being inconsistent, but it's not that people are changing their minds. Probably not, because if the past couple years have taught me anything, people don't really change their minds on anything all that much. People just get mad at each other, call each other a bunch of names, and nothing productive has actually been done. But also, with the changing of what games people are nostalgic for, comes the fact that the games that the previous people were nostalgic towards are going to get held in a much more critical light, as we're seeing now with Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver. See what I said? I was going to bring them back in. So Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver are pretty good remakes. They add a lot of content and basically do everything they can to completely replace the original Gold, Silver, and Crystal. There is no real reason to go back to Generation 2 because the remakes basically do everything those games did better. But in doing so, the games sort of failed to address a lot of the problems. They kept a lot of the level curve the exact same. But what's interesting is the fact that people who really love those games consider this to be a bashing of the older games by people who like the newer ones, which to an extent you could say that's what it is, but it's also just people who don't hold the games in such high regard sort of pointing to things that were flaws to begin with and sort of saying like, hey, isn't it weird that these perfect remakes didn't fix X glaring issue about original game? Like, that is something that totally is valid to say. And it'll be interesting to see what happens maybe 10, 15 years down the road when Sword and Shield and BDSP are sort of the games that are held in high regard due to the fact that the people who were children when those games came out are the dominant voices in the community. What are they going to say about games like, say, X and Y, or Sun and Moon? But ultimately, I think the one thing I can say about the community right now is, like, the Pokemon community can kind of just be an unpleasant space to be in sometimes. Like, there is a lot of negativity that gets thrown around constantly, and sure, a fair amount of it is a bit warranted from time to time. Like, there were a fair number of concerns and valid complaints against Sword and Shield that turned out to have merit after the games came out. But the problem is, anyone who said they liked the game got quickly shouted down as a shill. And so, overall my hope is that Legends Arceus is going to be the one game to rule them all. The game that sort of finally maybe brings this community back together by being good enough to drown out this constant sort of drone of naysayers and complainers. Because, yeah, the games might not look as good as they might have been able to, but overall, if they can deliver a good gameplay experience that blows previous games out of the water, I don't think that's going to matter. It never mattered before. I don't see why it should matter now. But until then, I'll see you guys around.